Imagine walking into a crumbling 1960s bank building that's been sitting empty for decades, thinking you just bought yourself a quirky fixer-upper project. But when Marina stepped through the heavy brass doors of First National Bank of Millbrook, she discovered something that would shake the very foundations of everything the town thought they knew about their past. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Behind the dusty teller windows, beneath layers of bureaucratic paperwork and forgotten safety deposit boxes, there was a vault that wasn't supposed to exist. What she found locked away in that steel chamber wasn't just old currency and abandoned treasures. It was evidence of a conspiracy that had been buried for over 50 years, and secrets that would force an entire community to confront the lies they'd been living with. Stay with me, because in the next hour and a half, you'll hear a story so extraordinary it will make you question what really happens when ordinary people stumble upon extraordinary truths. This is the story of how one woman's impulsive purchase became the key that unlocked decades of hidden history. The morning Marina Rodriguez signed the papers, the autumn air in Millbrook, Ohio, carried the scent of dying leaves and fresh possibilities. She stood outside Hartwell & Associates Real Estate, clutching a leather portfolio that contained the deed to what everyone in town called that old eyesore on Maple Street. At 38, Marina had already lived through enough disappointments to fill several lifetimes. A failed marriage to a man who treated ambition like a dirty word, a corporate career that had chewed her up and spit her out during the last round of layoffs, a mother who still asked, with genuine confusion, why she couldn't just settle down and be normal like other women her age. But Marina had never been good at normal. Even as a child, growing up in the suburbs of Cleveland, she'd been the one who asked too many questions, who poked at loose floorboards just to see what was underneath, who collected old keys without knowing what doors they might open. Her ex-husband used to call it destructive curiosity. Her therapist called it a healthy desire for authentic experience. Marina just called it being herself. The bank building had been on the market for 3 years. 3 years of realtors shaking their heads, of investors taking one look and walking away, of the city council debating whether to just tear it down and turn the lot into another strip mall parking area. Built in 1962, First National Bank of Millbrook had been the pride of the downtown district for exactly 17 years, before corporate mergers and changing economics forced it to close its doors in 1979. Since then, it had sat like a monument to abandoned dreams. The Art Deco facade had weathered from cream to dingy gray. The large windows that once displayed community announcements and loan rates were now covered with plywood. Weeds pushed through cracks in the sidewalk, and local teenagers had claimed the back alley as their unofficial gathering spot, leaving behind cigarette butts and spray-painted declarations of temporary love. Marina had first noticed the building 6 months earlier during one of her aimless drives through small Ohio towns. She'd been doing that a lot since the divorce was finalized, just driving, windows down, radio off, letting the landscape tell her stories about the lives people built in places that time seemed to have forgotten. When she saw the for sale sign leaning against the bank's front entrance, she'd pulled over without really knowing why. Something about the building's stubborn presence, the way it refused to crumble despite decades of neglect, spoke to her. She'd cupped her hands against one of the unboarded windows and peered inside. The interior was dim, but she could make out the skeleton of what had once been a functioning financial institution. Teller windows with brass bars, a reception area with mid-century modern furniture covered in dust sheets, and in the back, barely visible in the shadows, the outline of what could only be the vault. That night, she'd called the number on the sign.
The realtor, a woman named Beth Carpenter, who sounded like she'd been trying to unload the property since the Carter administration, had been almost aggressive in her honesty about the building's problems. Foundation issues, electrical systems that hadn't been updated since the Nixon era, plumbing that would need to be completely replaced, a roof that leaked in 12 different places. I'm legally obligated to tell you that 3 separate contractors have walked away from estimates on this place, and the city inspector won't even go inside anymore with a hard hat and a tetanus shot. But Marina had heard something else in the woman's voice, a kind of weary affection, like someone talking about a difficult relative they couldn't quite give up on. "What did it used to be like?" Marina had asked. "When it was still operating, I mean." There had been a long pause. Then Beth's voice had softened. "My grandmother worked there for 32 years. Started as a secretary in 1963, worked her way up to assistant manager by the time they closed. She used to say it was the heart of downtown. People didn't just come there to do their banking. They came to catch up on gossip, to ask advice about their kids, to show off their new grandchildren. It was where the community gathered." "What happened to it?"
Same thing that happened to a lot of small-town banks in the 70s. Corporate buyouts, consolidation, efficiency experts who thought a building's value could be measured in square footage and quarterly profits. Beth had sighed. "My grandmother cried the day they locked the doors for the last time. Said it felt like the town was losing its memory." That conversation had planted something in Marina's mind. Not a plan exactly, but a possibility. She'd started researching the building's history, spending late nights scrolling through local newspaper archives and county records. She'd learned that First National had been founded by a group of local businessmen who wanted to keep their community's money invested in their community's future, that it had helped finance the construction of the local high school, the renovation of the town square, dozens of small businesses that had thrived for decades. She'd also learned about the mysterious circumstances surrounding its closure. According to the newspaper reports, the bank had been financially stable right up until the end. No bad loans, no scandals, no obvious reason why it couldn't have continued operating as an independent institution. But somehow, within the span of 6 months, it had been sold to a larger regional bank, its accounts had been transferred, and the building had been abandoned. The more Marina read, the more questions she had. Questions that seemed to echo her grandmother's stories about the old neighborhood back in Cleveland, where thriving communities had been slowly dismantled by forces too large and impersonal for ordinary people to understand or resist. 3 weeks later, she'd made an offer. Not because she had a business plan, or because she'd done a thorough financial analysis, or because anyone in her life thought it was a good idea. She'd made the offer because something about the building's story felt unfinished, and she'd spent too many years of her life accepting other people's endings to her own stories. The price had been laughably low, less than what most people spent on a decent used car. The seller was a holding company that apparently had been waiting decades for someone, anyone, to take the property off their hands. The paperwork had gone through with surprising speed, as if the universe was eager to see what would happen when Marina Rodriguez became the unlikely owner of an abandoned bank in a town where she knew exactly 3 people. Now, standing outside the real estate office with the deed in her hands, Marina felt the familiar combination of terror and exhilaration that had preceded every major decision in her life. Her savings account was nearly empty. Her family thought she'd lost her mind. Her practical side was screaming at her to turn around, drive back to Cleveland, and find a sensible apartment and a sensible job like a sensible woman approaching 40. But as she looked down Maple Street toward the building that now belonged to her, Marina felt something she hadn't experienced in years. She felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing, even if she couldn't yet explain why. The walk from the real estate office to the bank took exactly 4 minutes. 4 minutes during which Marina noticed things she'd missed during her previous visits. The way the morning light hit the Art Deco details carved into the building's facade. The solid weight of the brass door handles, tarnished but still elegant. The small plaque near the entrance that read, First National Bank of Millbrook, serving our community since 1962. Built to last. Built to last. As Marina turned the key in the lock for the first time as the building's owner, she whispered those words back to the empty street, like a promise she wasn't quite ready to understand. The heavy brass door swung open with a groan that seemed to echo through decades of silence. Marina stepped across the threshold and into a world suspended in time, where dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that filtered through gaps in the plywood-covered windows. The interior of First National Bank of Millbrook was like stepping into a museum exhibit titled American Banking, circa 1970. The customer area stretched before her, a landscape of forgotten commerce. 4 teller windows lined the far wall, their brass bars still gleaming beneath layers of grime. The marble counters showed water stains and scratches, but the quality of the stone was undeniable. This had been built when banks were designed to inspire confidence through sheer permanence. To her left, a seating area held mid-century modern chairs in faded orange vinyl, their chrome legs tarnished but still reflecting the ambient light. A coffee table sat between them, its glass top cracked in a spiderweb pattern that somehow made it more beautiful, not less. Someone had left a 1978 copy of Time magazine on the table, its cover story about energy conservation now feeling prophetic rather than dated. Marina walked slowly through the space, her footsteps echoing off the high ceilings. The air carried the scent of old paper, furniture polish, and something else, a mustiness that spoke of secrets kept too long in dark places. Behind the teller area, she could see the bank officers' desks still arranged as if the employees had just stepped out for lunch and might return at any moment. She approached the nearest teller window and peered through the brass bars. The workspace beyond was surprisingly intact. Adding machines sat ready for calculations that would never come. Deposit slips were still stacked in neat piles, yellowed with age but perfectly organized. A small desk calendar showed October 1979, the date circled in red ink with a notation that read, Final day, thank you for 17 years. The personal touches were what broke her heart. At one station, a small framed photo showed a woman in her 50s standing next to a graduation cake, beaming with pride. At another, a coffee mug declared World's Best Grandma in faded blue letters. These weren't just workspaces that had been abandoned. They were pieces of people's lives, frozen at the moment when their community's economic heart stopped beating. Marina found the gate that led behind the teller line and pushed it open. The hinges protested, but the mechanism still worked. She was now standing in the operational heart of what had once been Millbrook's financial center, surrounded by the tools and systems that had processed decades of dreams, fears, and aspirations. The loan officer's desk drew her attention. Unlike the teller stations, this area showed signs of hasty departure. Papers were scattered across the desktop, some falling to the floor. File drawers hung open, their contents either removed or disturbed. A leather appointment book lay open to October 15th, 1979, with several meetings scheduled but crossed out in angry red ink. Marina picked up one of the scattered documents carefully. It was a loan application for a local restaurant owner, requesting funds to expand his dining room. The paperwork was complete, references were attached, and someone had written, approved, $15,000 in the margin. But the application was dated October 20th, 1979, 5 days after the bank had already closed forever. She found more evidence of interrupted business scattered around the desk. A stack of approved loan documents that had never been finalized. A list of local businesses marked for follow-up visits. A handwritten note that read, Call Henderson, reconstruction loan. He's been waiting 3 weeks for an answer. The picture that emerged was not of a failing institution winding down operations, but of a thriving business cut off midstream. Whatever had caused First National Bank of Millbrook to close, it hadn't been a gradual decline. It had been sudden, unexpected and apparently devastating to the community it served. Marina made her way to the manager's office, a glass-walled space that had once offered its occupant a clear view of the entire banking floor. The nameplate on the desk read Harrison Clark, President. And unlike the other areas, this office felt deliberately cleared. The desk drawers were empty, the filing cabinets locked, and only a few personal items remained: a brass letter opener, a University of Michigan paperweight, and a framed photograph of the bank's opening day in 1962. The opening day photo was fascinating. It showed a crowd of well-dressed Millbrook residents gathered in front of the bank's gleaming new facade. Harrison Clark, looking impossibly young in a narrow tie and crisp white shirt, was cutting a ceremonial ribbon while local dignitaries applauded. But what caught Marina's attention was the expression on Clark's face. Even in the grainy black and white image, she could see something that looked like determination mixed with worry, as if he knew even then that keeping a community bank alive would be an uphill battle. She spent the next hour exploring the rest of the main floor. The break room still held a percolator coffee pot and a refrigerator that hummed ominously when she plugged it in to test the electrical system. The supply closet was stocked with forms and letterhead that would never be used. In a corner office marked New Accounts, she found a presentation easel with a half-finished pitch for something called Future Savers, Club Banking Education for Tomorrow's Leaders. But it was the basement that really intrigued her. A narrow staircase led down from behind the teller area, disappearing into shadows that her phone's flashlight couldn't quite penetrate. The air grew cooler as she descended, and she could hear the distant hum of machinery that apparently still functioned after all these years. The basement was larger than she had expected, stretching beneath the entire footprint of the building. Most of the space was taken up by mechanical systems, the furnace, electrical panels, and what looked like an early computer system that probably weighed more than her car. But along the far wall, she discovered something that made her pulse quicken. Storage areas, not just a few filing cabinets, but an entire archive. Metal shelving units stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with boxes labeled by year and category. Loan applications, 1962 to 1965. Board meeting minutes, 1968 to 1972. Correspondence, State Banking Commission, 1975 to 1979. Marina pulled down one of the boxes from 1979 and opened it carefully. Inside were dozens of files, each one representing a piece of the bank's final year. She read through loan approvals for local farmers, correspondence about a proposed shopping center, and meeting notes about the bank's expansion plans for the 1980s. Again, nothing suggested an institution in decline. But at the bottom of the box, she found something that made her stop cold. A manila envelope marked Confidential, H. Clark Only in heavy black ink. The envelope wasn't sealed, and she could see papers inside. Her trembled hands slightly as she opened it. The first document was a letter from the State Banking Commission dated September 15, 1979. The official language was dense and bureaucratic, but the message was clear. First National Bank of Millbrook was being investigated for irregularities in reporting procedures and failure to comply with new federal oversight requirements. The letter demanded access to all records related to special accounts and non-standard transactions, and warned that failure to cooperate would result in immediate regulatory action. The second document was Harrison Clark's handwritten response, dated September 18, 1979. Unlike the official correspondence, Clark's letter was personal, almost desperate. He wrote, "I've operated this bank with complete integrity for 17 years. Every loan, every investment, every decision has been made with this community's best interests at heart. If there are irregularities in our reporting, they stem from our commitment to serving local needs, rather than satisfying distant bureaucrats who don't understand what community banking actually means.
The final document in the envelope was a newspaper clipping from the Millbrook Gazette, dated October 16, 1979. The headline read, "Local Bank Closes Amid Regulatory Concerns," but the article was surprisingly brief and vague. It mentioned compliance issues and voluntary closure, but provided no real details about what had actually happened. Marina sat back on her heels, surrounded by boxes of records that told a story no one had apparently wanted to tell. A successful community bank had been shut down not because it was failing, but because it was somehow not following rules that seemed designed for larger, more impersonal institutions. She thought about the loan applications she'd found upstairs, the approved deals that had never been finalized, the local businesses that had apparently been left hanging when their community's primary source of capital vanished overnight. How many dreams had died when First National closed its doors? But even more intriguing was the question of why all these records had been left behind. In every business closure she'd ever heard of, the important documents were transferred to successor institutions or regulatory agencies. Yet here was an entire archive abandoned in a basement, as if someone had wanted it to be forgotten. As she climbed back up the stairs, Marina felt the familiar tingle of a mystery demanding to be solved. She'd bought this building thinking she was purchasing a renovation project, but what she'd actually acquired was a puzzle, one that had been waiting for 45 years for someone curious enough to start putting the pieces together. The late afternoon sun was slanting through the plywood gaps when she finally locked the front door behind her. As she stood on the sidewalk looking back at her building, Marina noticed something she'd missed before. Across the street, an elderly man was watching her from the window of what looked like a barber shop. When their eyes met, he quickly stepped back from the glass, disappearing into the shadows of his shop. Marina made a mental note to introduce herself soon. In a town like Millbrook, the barber would know everyone's story, and she had a feeling she was going to need all the help she could get to understand what had really happened to First National Bank, and why someone had gone to such lengths to bury the truth. Marina couldn't shake the image of the elderly man watching her from across the street. That night, in her cramped motel room at the Millbrook Inn, she found herself staring out the window toward the dark silhouette of her bank building, wondering what stories the town's longtime residents might be keeping to themselves. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of October weather that made small Ohio towns look like photographs from decades past. Marina had planned to spend the day cataloging the basement archives, but something pulled her toward the barber shop first. The red, white, and blue pole outside spun lazily in the morning mist, and through the window she could see the same elderly man sweeping around an old-fashioned barber chair. The bell above the door chimed as she entered. The shop was a time capsule. Black and white checkered floor, vintage advertisements for hair tonic and shaving cream, and the unmistakable smell of barbicide and aftershaving. The man looked up from his sweeping, and Marina was struck by the sharpness of his pale blue eyes, alert and intelligent despite his obvious age. "You're the one who bought Harrison's old bank," he said without preamble. "I am, Marina Rodriguez." She extended her hand, which he took with a firm grip that spoke of decades of manual work. "Frank Kowalski. Been cutting hair in this spot for 53 years. He gestured toward the chair. "Need a trim, or are you here to ask questions about things that happened before you were born?" Marina laughed despite herself. "The second one, I think, though I might need that trim eventually." Frank set his broom aside and studied her for a long moment. "Harrison Clark was a good man. Whatever you heard about why that bank closed
Whatever's written in those newspaper articles, it wasn't the whole truth. What was the whole truth? Frank moved to the window and adjusted the blinds, giving him a clear view of the bank building across the street. Harrison and I served together in Vietnam. Different units, but we met in a field hospital outside Da Nang in '68. Both of us caught shrapnel from the same mortar attack. Spent 3 weeks in adjacent beds, talking about what we were going to do when we got home. He paused, lost in memory. Harrison had this dream about community banking. Said he'd seen too many small towns die because their money got sucked away to big cities, invested in things that had nothing to do with the people who earned it. He wanted to build something different. Marina leaned against the counter, sensing that Frank was sharing something he'd kept private for a long time. When we got back to Ohio, Harrison made good on his promise, convinced a group of local businessmen to back him, found investors who believed in keeping money local. That bank wasn't just a business to him. It was a mission. So what happened in 1979? Frank's expression darkened. What happened was politics. Big banks had been lobbying for deregulation, said they could serve small communities better than local institutions, made promises about efficiency and modernization. But they needed examples of community banks that were supposedly mismanaged or corrupt to justify the changes they wanted. Marina felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. You're saying they targeted First National?
I'm saying Harrison got a visit in August of '79 from some federal banking regulators who seemed more interested in finding problems than solving them. They wanted access to everything, customer records, loan files, investment decisions, but especially the safe deposit box records. Why safe deposit boxes? Frank moved away from the window and began organizing bottles of hair tonic with unnecessary precision. Because that's where people in small towns keep their real secrets. Family documents, property deeds that go back generations, insurance policies, jewelry that survived the Depression. In 1979, safe deposit boxes weren't computerized. The only record of what was in them was kept locally. The implications hit Marina like a physical blow. Someone wanted access to those records. Harrison thought so. He started asking questions, making phone calls to other community bank presidents across Ohio. Turned out First National wasn't the only institution being investigated. There was a pattern. Small banks in towns with valuable real estate or development potential were being targeted for compliance reviews that always seemed to find fatal problems. Frank pulled a metal stool from behind the counter and sat down heavily. Harrison was stubborn, too stubborn for his own good. When they told him to turn over the safe deposit box records, he refused, said his customers had a right to privacy, that the bank had a fiduciary duty to protect their information. That's when they shut him down. That's when they destroyed him. Frank's voice carried decades of suppressed anger. They froze the bank's assets, called in federal auditors, leaked stories to regional newspapers about serious irregularities. Harrison never got a chance to defend himself properly. By the time the dust settled, his reputation was ruined, his investors had lost everything, and Millbrook's primary source of local capital was gone forever. Marina thought about the loan applications she'd found, the local businesses that had been left in limbo. What happened to Harrison? He left town 3 days after the bank closed, said he couldn't bear to watch what would happen to Millbrook without local banking. Some people said he went to Florida, others claimed he moved to California, but nobody really knew. And after a few years, people stopped asking. The morning rain had intensified, drumming against the barbershop's windows. Marina watched the water stream down the glass, thinking about the patterns Frank had described. You said other banks were targeted. Do you know what happened to those towns? Frank nodded grimly. Within 5 years, most of them had been transformed. Family farms sold to agribusiness corporations, Main Street businesses replaced by chain stores, historic districts rezoned for commercial development. The old-timers called it progress, but it felt more like colonization. And Millbrook? We've held on better than most, partly because Harrison's closure scared everyone into being extra careful about outside investments. But you can see the signs if you know what to look for. The old Thompson farm on Route 9 was sold to developers last year. The antique district downtown has been struggling since the big box stores opened on the interstate.
We're losing our young people to Columbus and Cincinnati because there aren't enough good jobs to keep them here." Marina felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to connect. "Frank, do you think Harrison left anything behind? Any evidence of what really happened?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if trying to determine whether she could be trusted with dangerous knowledge. Finally, he spoke. "Harrison was a methodical man, kept detailed records of everything, and he was smart enough to know that if they were willing to destroy his bank to get what they wanted, they might be willing to destroy him too." Frank paused. 3 days before the closure, he asked me to meet him at the bank after hours. When I got there, he was coming up from the basement, and he looked different. Relieved, maybe, or satisfied, like he'd just finished something important. "Did he tell you what he'd done?"
He said he'd made sure the truth would survive, even if he didn't. Then he handed me that envelope and made me promise to wait for someone who would know what to do with it. Marina felt her heart racing. "You think he hid something in the bank?" Frank nodded slowly. "I think Harrison Clark was too smart and too angry to go down without leaving a trail for someone brave enough to follow it. The question is whether you're that someone." As Marina left the barber shop, the envelope tucked safely in her jacket pocket, she realized that what she'd thought was a simple renovation project had become something much more complex and potentially dangerous. She wasn't just restoring an old building, she was unearthing a buried conspiracy that had shaped the destiny of an entire community. The rain had stopped, but the clouds remained heavy and threatening. As she crossed the street toward her bank, Marina couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, not just by Frank from his window, but by others whose faces she couldn't see, people who might not be happy about her interest in Harrison Clark's secrets. She had work to do. Marina spent the rest of that morning poring over Frank's documents in the cramped confines of the bank manager's office. Each page revealed another layer of what appeared to be a coordinated effort to eliminate community banks across rural Ohio. The list of properties in Millbrook was particularly telling. Every piece of prime real estate in town was noted with annotations about development potential and acquisition targets. But it was the correspondence between Harrison and other bank presidents that truly chilled her. Letters describing mysterious regulatory visits, sudden audits, and pressure to sell to larger institutions. A pattern emerged of small, successful community banks being systematically dismantled through bureaucratic warfare and regulatory intimidation. By noon, Marina felt like she was drowning in theories but starving for concrete evidence. She needed to find whatever Harrison had hidden, and she had a growing suspicion that it was somewhere in this building. The basement archives were extensive, but they were also obvious. If Harrison had wanted to hide something truly important, he would have chosen a location that federal investigators wouldn't think to search. She stood in the main banking floor, trying to think like a man who knew his life's work was about to be destroyed. Where would someone hide evidence in a bank? Somewhere secure, somewhere private, somewhere that wouldn't be accessible to casual investigators. Her eyes drifted toward the back wall, where the massive circular door of the bank vault dominated the space like a steel moon. She'd been avoiding the vault since her first day, partly because it looked intimidatingly complex, and partly because she'd assumed it would be empty. Banks didn't typically leave valuables behind when they closed. But what if this vault held more than just valuables? Marina approached the imposing steel door with new curiosity. The vault was clearly built to last. Thick steel walls, a combination lock that looked like it belonged on a battleship, and hinges that could probably support the weight of a car. A brass nameplate near the lock read, "Mosler Safe Company, Cincinnati, Ohio, 1962. She examined the combination lock, a massive circular mechanism with numbers arranged around its perimeter. There was no way she could crack this without knowing the combination, and even if she could, she wasn't sure she should. Breaking into a bank vault, even one she owned, felt like crossing a legal line she wasn't prepared to cross. But as she studied the mechanism more closely, she noticed something odd. Scratched into the metal near the lock, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, were faint markings, numbers, etched with something sharp. 15, 42, 68. Marina's pulse quickened. Could it really be that simple? She looked around the empty bank as if someone might stop her, then carefully began turning the combination lock. Right to 15, left to 42, right to 68. Nothing happened. She tried again, reversing the direction. Left to 15, right to 42, left to 68. Still nothing. She stepped back, frustrated. Maybe the numbers weren't a combination. Maybe they were dates or account numbers or some other kind of code. She was about to give up when another possibility occurred to her. What if the scratched numbers weren't the actual combination? What if they were just part of it? She thought about what Frank had told her about Harrison's military service. Vietnam, 1968. The same year scratched near the lock. What other numbers would have been significant to a Vietnam veteran who'd served in 1968? She pulled out her phone and searched for information about major Vietnam battles in 1968. The Tet Offensive had begun on January 30th. Could that be it? She tried 1-30-68, but the lock remained stubbornly closed. Then she remembered Frank mentioning that he and Harrison had met in a field hospital. Military hospitals use different numbering systems. What if the combination was Harrison's service number, or his unit designation, or his hospital bed number? She was running out of ideas when she noticed something else about the scratched numbers. They were positioned next to 3 small indentations in the metal, as if someone had marked specific positions on the combination lock's face. What if 15, 42, 68 weren't the actual combination numbers, but just positions on the dial? Marina counted carefully around the lock's perimeter. At 15, the number was 7. At 42, the number was 23. At 68, the number was 11. 7, 23, 11. She tried the combination with growing excitement. Right to 7, left to 23, right to 11. The lock clicked. Marina's hands shook as she grasped the massive wheel that controlled the vault door's locking mechanism. She turned it slowly, feeling the heavy bolts retract with mechanical precision. The door was incredibly heavy, but it swung open smoothly on its well-engineered hinges. Cool air flowed out of the vault, carrying the metallic scent of steel and something else, old paper and leather. Marina stepped inside, her phone's flashlight revealing a space larger than she'd expected. The vault was roughly 8 feet square, with safety deposit boxes lining 3 walls and a small table in the center. Most of the safety deposit boxes hung open, their contents long since removed. But the table held something that made Marina's breath catch: a leather briefcase, placed precisely in the center of the surface as if someone had positioned it for maximum visibility. Marina approached the briefcase cautiously. Unlike everything else in the bank, this showed no signs of age or neglect. The leather was supple, the brass fittings bright, the lock mechanism clean and functional. A small tag attached to the handle bore a single word, written in careful script: truth. The briefcase wasn't locked. Marina opened it with trembling fingers and found herself looking at the most comprehensive collection of evidence she could have imagined. Financial records, correspondence, photographs, and what appeared to be a complete paper trail documenting the systematic destruction of community banks across the Midwest. The top document was a letter addressed to whoever finds this, written in Harrison Clark's distinctive handwriting. If you're reading this, then my fears have proven justified, and I am no longer here to tell this story myself. What you'll find in this briefcase represents 3 years of investigation into what I believe to be a coordinated conspiracy to eliminate independent community banks and transfer their assets, customer relationships, and local knowledge to larger institutions with ties to development interests. I am not a conspiracy theorist by nature. I am a banker, trained to deal in facts and documentation. Everything in this briefcase can be verified through public records, though you'll need to know where to look. The pattern is clear to anyone willing to see it. Identify thriving community banks in areas with development potential,
manufacture regulatory crises, force closures or sales, then facilitate rapid development of previously protected or locally controlled properties. I chose to hide this evidence rather than release it because I believe the people responsible are dangerous, and because I hope that someday, someone with the resources and determination to see justice done will find it. If that person is you, please be careful. These people have already demonstrated their willingness to destroy lives and communities to achieve their goals. The letter was dated October 12, 1979, just 4 days before the bank had closed forever. Marina carefully examined the other contents of the briefcase. There were financial records showing suspicious patterns of property acquisitions following bank closures, photographs of meetings between federal regulators and development company executives, copies of internal memos discussing strategic property consolidation and optimal timing for regulatory intervention. But the most damning evidence was a series of recorded conversations. Harrison had apparently been secretly recording his phone calls during the final months of the bank's operation. The briefcase contained a small tape recorder and dozens of cassette tapes, each labeled with dates and participants. Marina picked up one tape labeled RM Final Warning, October 10, 1979, and inserted it into the recorder. After a moment of static, she heard Harrison's voice, tense but controlled. Harrison Clark, First National Bank of Millbrook, October 10, 1979, 3:17 p.m. Recording conversation with caller identifying himself as Robert Morrison. Then another voice, smooth and confident. Mr. Clark, I trust you've had time to reconsider our previous discussions. Your cooperation in this matter would benefit everyone involved. What you're asking me to do would violate every principle of banking ethics and customer privacy. I won't turn over those records. Mr. Clark, you seem to be under the impression that you have a choice in this matter. Let me be clear. Your bank will be closed by the end of this month. The only question is whether that closure happens smoothly, with minimal disruption to your community, or whether it becomes a messy, public affair that damages everyone involved. Are you threatening me? I'm offering you a chance to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. Millbrook has tremendous development potential, but that potential can't be realized as long as local financial institutions prioritize sentiment over progress. Your customers will be better served by modern banking institutions that understand the bigger picture. What you mean is that they'll be better served by banks that will approve loans for your development projects without asking inconvenient questions about environmental impact or community benefit. There was a long pause. Then Morrison's voice returned, colder than before. Mr. Clark, I've tried to handle this situation with respect for your position and your years of service to this community, but my patience has limits. You have 48 hours to reconsider your position. After that, events will proceed without your input. The tape ended with the click of a phone being hung up. Marina sat in the vault's cool silence, processing what she'd just heard. This wasn't just evidence of regulatory harassment or financial manipulation. This was proof of a deliberate conspiracy to destroy community banks and facilitate corporate development. And Robert Morrison, whoever he was, had been willing to threaten a respected community leader to achieve his goals. She looked around the vault with new understanding. Harrison hadn't just hidden evidence, he'd created a time capsule, preserving the truth about what happened to Millbrook and dozens of other small Ohio communities. The question now was what she was going to do with that truth. As Marina carefully packed the briefcase and prepared to leave the vault, she couldn't shake the feeling that her discovery was just the beginning. Harrison's evidence proved that a conspiracy had existed in 1979. But what about now? Were the same forces still at work? Still systematically destroying communities for profit?
She thought about the development projects Frank had mentioned, the gradual erosion of Millbrook's local character, the young people leaving for opportunities elsewhere. Maybe the conspiracy hadn't ended with Harrison's bank closure. Maybe it had just evolved, become more sophisticated, harder to detect. Marina secured the vault and made her way back to the main banking floor, the briefcase clutched tightly in her hands. She had the evidence Harrison Clark had died protecting, but she also had something Harrison hadn't possessed, the perspective that came from 45 years of distance and the resources of the digital age. It was time to find out what had happened to Robert Morrison and whether his war against community banking was still being fought. Marina spent that entire evening in her motel room, surrounded by the contents of Harrison's briefcase like a detective working a cold case. She'd spread everything across the small table in both beds: documents, photographs, and cassette tapes that painted a picture of corruption that went far beyond what she'd initially imagined. The recorded conversations were particularly revealing. Harrison had documented phone calls with federal banking regulators who seemed less interested in actual compliance issues than in creating justifications for closure. There were recordings of conversations with other community bank presidents facing similar pressure, their voices tight with frustration and growing desperation. But it was the financial records that truly opened the Marina's eyes to the scope of the conspiracy. Harrison had tracked property transactions in 17 different Ohio towns where community banks had been forced to close between 1977 and 1980. In every case, the pattern was identical: regulatory pressure, forced closure, and rapid development by the same constellation of companies. Marina pulled out her laptop and began cross-referencing the company names from Harrison's files with current business records. What she found made her stomach clench. Morrison Development Corporation wasn't just still in business, it had become one of the largest commercial development firms in the Midwest, with projects spanning from Ohio to Illinois to Indiana. She searched for Robert Morrison and found a professional biography that read like a success story from a business magazine. Born in 1941, Morrison has started his career as a federal banking regulator before founding his development company in 1981. He'd built shopping centers, office complexes, and residential developments across dozens of former agricultural communities. His company's website featured testimonials from mayors and city council members praising his vision for modernizing rural America. But when Marina dug deeper, using the specific towns mentioned in Harrison's files, a different picture emerged. She found newspaper archives describing the aftermath of bank closures in places like Riverside, Ohio, and Millfield, Indiana. Family farms sold to agribusiness corporations. Main Street businesses closed and replaced by chain stores. Historic buildings demolished to make way for strip malls and parking lots. The human cost was documented in local newspaper stories that Morrison's corporate biography didn't mention. Elderly residents forced to relocate when their communities lost essential services. Young people leaving for cities because local jobs disappeared. Small business owners who'd built their lives around serving local customers, watching their customer base evaporate as chain stores moved in. Marina found herself thinking about her grandmother, who'd lived through the slow death of her Cleveland neighborhood as local businesses were replaced by national chains that had no connection to the community they served. Her grandmother had always blamed progress for the changes, but maybe it hadn't been progress at all. Maybe it had been something much more deliberate and predatory. At midnight, Marina made a decision that surprised her. She picked up her phone and called the number listed for Morrison Development Corporation. She didn't expect anyone to answer, but after 4 rings, she heard a professional female voice. "Morrison Development, this is the answering service. How may I help you?" Marina hadn't prepared for this possibility. I'm trying to reach Robert Morrison. It's regarding some historical documents related to his early work in Ohio. Mr. Morrison doesn't typically take unsolicited calls, but I can take a message. May I ask what this is regarding? Marina's heart raced. Tell him it's about Harrison Clark and First National Bank of Millbrook. Tell him someone found the briefcase. There was a pause. I'll pass along your message. What's your contact information?
Marina gave her name and phone number, then hung up with shaking hands. She had no idea what she was doing, but something told her that directness might be her best strategy. If Morrison was still active in development and still using the same tactics, maybe she could draw him out by letting him know his past had been uncovered. Her phone rang at 6:47 a.m. Marina had been dozing fitfully, Harrison's documents still spread around her like evidence in a crime scene. She grabbed the phone without checking the caller ID. "Ms. Rodriguez, this is Robert Morrison. I understand you found some old documents that might interest me." Marina's mouth dried. She'd expected to wait days for a response, if she got one at all. "Mr. Morrison, yes, I've found quite a lot of interesting material." "I'm sure you have. Harrison Clark was a meticulous record keeper, not always accurate in his interpretations. I wonder if we might meet to discuss what you've discovered. I'd hate for there to be any misunderstandings about historical events." The calm reasonableness of his tone made Marina more nervous than if he'd been obviously threatening. "I'm not sure there's much to misunderstand. The records seemed pretty clear about what happened in 1979. Miss Rodriguez, you're obviously an intelligent woman, or you wouldn't have been able to access Harrison's hiding place. But intelligence also means understanding that there are always multiple perspectives on complex situations. What might look like conspiracy to an outsider often turns out to be simple economic reality when viewed with proper context."
Marina gripped the phone tighter. And what context would make threatening a community bank president seem reasonable? Morrison chuckled, a sound that held no warmth. "I see Harrison's paranoia has influenced your interpretation of events. That's unfortunate, but not unexpected. People who resist necessary change often develop elaborate theories to explain their failures." "So you're admitting you knew Harrison Clark?" "Of course I knew him. I knew all the community bank presidents in my territory. It was part of my job as a federal banking regulator to ensure they were operating in compliance with federal guidelines. Some of them, like Harrison, preferred to view routine oversight as persecution." Marina felt a chill at how smoothly Morrison was rewriting history. "Mr. Morrison, I have recordings of conversations where you threatened Harrison Clark. Your own words preserved on tape." There was a longer pause this time. When Morrison spoke again, his tone had shifted subtly. "Ms. Rodriguez, I think you may not fully understand the legal and financial complexities of what you've stumbled into. Perhaps we should meet in person so I can help clarify some of these historical misconceptions." "I don't think that's necessary. I think I understand the situation perfectly well. I hope you'll reconsider. You see, ownership of abandoned property often involves complicated legal questions. Documents left behind in foreclosed buildings don't necessarily belong to the current property owner. There could be claims from previous stakeholders, legal challenges to your ownership, regulatory issues with possessing confidential banking records." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Morrison was suggesting he could create legal problems for Marina if she didn't cooperate. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Morrison?" "Not at all. I'm simply pointing out that complex situations often have unexpected complications, but they can also have simple solutions for people who are reasonable." Marina thought about Harrison Clark, who'd chosen to fight rather than be reasonable, and who disappeared from Millbrook shortly after his bank closed. What kind of solutions? The kind that benefit everyone involved. You've purchased an interesting building with significant development potential. I'm always looking for partnership opportunities with property owners who understand the value of progress. Perhaps we could discuss how to maximize your investment's potential while ensuring that any historical artifacts are properly preserved. The offer was smooth, professional, and absolutely terrifying. Morrison was proposing to buy her cooperation the same way he'd probably bought dozens of other potential obstacles over the decades. "I'll need to think about it," Marina said carefully. Of course, but don't think too long. Opportunities like this have a way of becoming more complicated the longer they remain unresolved. The line went dead. Marina sat in the growing morning light, her hands trembling as she set the phone aside. In less than 10 minutes, Robert Morrison had confirmed everything Harrison's evidence suggested, and more. He was still active, still using the same combination of legal threats and financial incentives to get what he wanted. And he just made it clear that Marina's discovery posed a threat to whatever current projects he was pursuing. She thought about Harrison Clark, who'd chosen to fight rather than be reasonable, and who disappeared from Millbrook shortly after his bank closed. At the time, it had seemed like the paranoia of a defeated man. Now it felt like a prophecy. Marina gathered Harrison's documents and packed them carefully back into the briefcase. She had a decision to make, and she suspected it would determine not just her own future, but the future of Millbrook and potentially many other communities where Morrison Development Corporation was pursuing partnership opportunities. She could take Morrison's offer, sell the building, and walk away with a profit and let the past stay buried. It would be the smart choice, the safe choice, the reasonable choice that would avoid the complications Morrison had so politely threatened. Or she could do what Harrison Clark couldn't do 45 years ago, fight back. Marina looked out her motel room window toward the abandoned bank where Harrison's truth had waited nearly half a century for someone to find it. The morning sun was hitting the Art Deco facade, highlighting details that decades of neglect couldn't completely obscure. The building had been built to last, designed by people who believed in permanence and community and institutions that served something larger than quarterly profits. She made her choice. Marina picked up her phone and dialed Frank Kowalski's barbershop. When he answered, she could hear the nervousness in his voice. News traveled fast in small towns, and someone had probably already told her about her early morning phone call from Morrison. "Frank, it's Marina. I found what Harrison hid, and I just got a call from Robert Morrison." There was a longer pause this time. When Frank spoke again, his voice was steady and determined. "What do you need me to do?" "I need you to help me tell this story the right way, before Morrison can stop us." Within an hour of Marina's call, Frank's barbershop had transformed into an impromptu war room. The elderly barber had made a series of phone calls to people he described as folks who remember what this town used to be like, and they'd had begun to arrive in pairs and small groups, their faces reflecting a mixture of curiosity and long-suppressed anger. "Before we go any further, Marina needs to understand what she's getting into. Show them the map, Dorothy."
Dorothy Chen spread a hand-drawn map across one of Frank's vintage barber chairs. It showed Millbrook as it had existed in 1979, with local businesses marked in green and family-owned properties outlined in blue. Then she overlaid a second map showing the town as it existed today, chain stores marked in red, corporate-owned properties outlined in black. "This is what 45 years of progress looks like," Dorothy said bitterly. "We lost the bank first, then the newspaper, then the hardware store, then the grocery store. Each time we were told it was just economics, just market forces, just the natural evolution of small-town America." Bill Thompson leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped tightly. "What we didn't understand then was that it was all connected. The bank closure made it harder for local businesses to get loans. Without local lending, family farms couldn't expand or modernize. Without successful farms and businesses, young people left for opportunities elsewhere. Without young families, schools consolidated and services disappeared." Margaret Sullivan nodded grimly. "And every step of the way there was always a helpful development company ready to buy up the pieces at discount prices. Morrison Development bought the old school building in 1985, turned it into a warehouse. They bought the Thompson farm in 1983, sold it to Mega Agri Corporation. They've been picking at this town like vultures for decades." Marina felt the weight of what she'd stumbled into settling on her shoulders.
You all knew about Morrison's involvement? We suspected, Frank said, but suspecting and proving are two different things, and Harrison's evidence disappeared with him. Until now. Dorothy Chen pulled out a manila folder thick with newspaper clippings. I kept copies of everything I could before the paper was sold. Articles about the bank closure, property sales, business closures. I always thought there was a story there, but I could never prove the connections. Marina opened Harrison's briefcase and began spreading out the documents on Frank's counter. The room fell silent as the residents of Millbrook saw, for the first time, concrete evidence of what many had suspected for decades. Bill Thompson picked up one of the recorded conversations, his hands shaking slightly. My God! They recorded their own crimes? Harrison was smart. He knew that without proof it would just be his word against federal regulators and development companies. But with recordings, we can prove that what happened to Millbrook wasn't natural economic evolution. It was a deliberate strategy to asset strip small communities. Dorothy Chen was studying the financial records that tracked property transactions. Look at this timeline. Morrison's company didn't just benefit from the changes, they orchestrated them. Bank closes in October 1979. First property acquisition happens in November 1979. They were ready to move the moment Harrison was out of the way. Margaret Sullivan found the photographs Harrison had taken of meetings between regulators and development executives. I remember this man, she said, pointing to a figure in one of the images. He came to my dress shop in 1984, said he was conducting a survey about downtown retail trends, asked a lot of questions about my lease, my customer base, my profit margins. 2 months later, I got notice that my rent was being tripled. Marina felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. Morrison wasn't just targeting banks. He was gathering intelligence on entire communities, identifying vulnerabilities, planning systematic takeovers. Frank walked to his window and looked across the street at the bank building. The question is, what do we do with this information? Harrison tried to fight them and lost everything. What makes us think we can succeed where he failed? Marina thought about her conversation with Morrison, the smooth threats disguised as helpful advice. Because we have something Harrison didn't have. We have 45 years of hindsight, we have the internet, and we have each other. She pulled out her laptop and began connecting it to Frank's wireless printer. Apparently the old barber had embraced some modern technologies. Morrison thinks he's dealing with the same isolated resistance he faced in 1979. One person with evidence that can be discredited or suppressed. But what if this story goes public? What if other communities start asking questions about their own mysterious bank closures and development booms? Dorothy Chen's eyes lit up. You want to go public with Harrison's evidence? I want to do more than that. I want to investigate whether Morrison is still using the same tactics today. If we can prove he's currently engaged in the same kind of conspiracy, then we can stop him, Bill Thompson said quietly. Maybe save other communities from what happened to us. Marina began printing copies of Harrison's most damning documents. Frank, you said Morrison Development has been active in Millbrook recently. What projects are they working on now? Frank exchanged glances with the others. They've been buying up properties around the old railroad depot. Officially, it's for a mixed-use project that's supposed to bring jobs and tourism to downtown. But the properties they're targeting are all locally owned businesses that have managed to survive the past 40 years. Margaret Sullivan spoke up. My nephew runs the antique shop near the depot. He said a man from Morrison Development offered to buy his building for 3 times what it's worth, but only if he agreed to close his business immediately and sign a non-disclosure agreement about the sale. Marina felt her pulse quicken. That's the same strategy from 1979. Identify key properties, make offers that seem generous but include conditions that benefit the development company, isolate business owners so they can't coordinate resistance. Dorothy Chen was studying the map again. If Morrison controls the depot area, He controls access to the historic district. He could effectively cut off foot traffic to any remaining local businesses. And once those businesses fail, Bill Thompson added, he can buy their properties for a fraction of what they're worth and redevelop the entire downtown according to his plans. Marina looked around the room at faces that reflected decades of frustrated helplessness. What if we could warn the other business owners, show them Harrison's evidence, help them understand what they're really up against? Frank nodded slowly. Most of them know something's not right. They just don't know what they're fighting. Then let's show them, Marina said. But we need to be smart about this. Morrison has resources we don't have. Lawyers, money, political connections. Our advantage is that we have the truth and we have each other. Dorothy Chin was already pulling out her phone. I still have contacts at newspapers across Ohio. If we can document a pattern of Morrison's activities in multiple communities. And I know family farmers in 6 counties who've been dealing with pressure to sell to agribusiness, Bill Thompson added. Some of them might be willing to talk if they knew their problems were part of a larger pattern. Margaret Sullivan looked thoughtful. My church has connections with congregations in small towns across the Midwest. A lot of pastors have watched their communities struggle with the same issues we're facing. They might be willing to help spread the word. Marina felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope mixed with purpose. We're not just fighting for Millbrook anymore. We're fighting for the idea that communities should control their own destinies instead of being harvested by corporations that see them as nothing more than asset portfolios. Frank walked to an old filing cabinet and pulled out a folder Marina hadn't seen before. If we're really going to do this, there's something else you need to know. Harrison didn't just hide that briefcase in the vault. 3 days before the bank closed, he gave me this. He handed Marina a sealed envelope marked insurance policy in Harrison's handwriting. Marina opened it carefully and found a single sheet of paper with an address in Columbus, Ohio, and a name, Dr. Elizabeth Warren, Professor of Banking Law, Ohio State University. Below that, a handwritten note. If the worst happens, she'll know what to do with the evidence. Frank watched Marina's expression. I called that number yesterday after you found the briefcase. Dr. Warren retired years ago, but her daughter said she's still sharp and still angry about what happened to community banking in the 1980s. She wants to meet with you. Marina looked around the room at the faces of people who'd spent decades watching their communities slowly die while being told it was progress. They were offering to help her fight a battle that Harrison Clark had lost 45 years ago, using weapons he hadn't possessed. Modern communication, a broader understanding of corporate tactics, and the accumulated anger of multiple generations who'd watched their communities be strip-mined for profit. When can we meet with Dr. Warren? Marina asked. Tomorrow afternoon, Frank replied. She said to bring everything. Marina carefully packed Harrison's evidence back into the briefcase, but this time she wasn't carrying it alone. Tomorrow, she would learn whether an elderly law professor could help turn a small-town conspiracy into a case that might finally bring justice for Harrison Clark and prevent other communities from suffering Millbrook's fate. Outside, the October sky was darkening toward evening, but inside Frank's barbershop, something that had been dormant for 45 years was finally beginning to stir back to life. The possibility of resistance. Dr. Elizabeth Warren's office at Ohio State University was exactly what Marina had expected from a retired banking law professor. Walls lined with legal texts, boxes of research materials stacked in every corner, and the kind of organized chaos that spoke of a mind that never stopped working. At 78, Dr. Warren moved with the careful precision of someone whose body had aged but whose intellect remained razor-sharp. Harrison Clark, she said without preamble, as Marina, Frank, and Dorothy settled into chairs around her cluttered desk. I've been waiting 45 years for someone to bring me this briefcase. Marina felt a jolt of surprise. You knew about the evidence? Harrison called me 3 days before his bank closed, said he'd documented a conspiracy but wasn't sure he'd live long enough to see justice done. He asked if I'd be willing to review his evidence if someone ever brought it to me. Dr. Warren's eyes were bright with long-suppressed anger. I told him I'd been investigating similar patterns in community bank closures across the Midwest and would be very interested in whatever he'd found. Frank leaned forward. You never heard from him again? No. Harrison disappeared, the bank closed, and the evidence vanished with him. I spent the next 10 years trying to prove what I suspected was happening, but without concrete documentation. She gestured toward the briefcase. May I? Marina opened Harrison's briefcase and watched Dr. Warren's face transform as she examined the contents. The retired professor handled each document with the reverence of an archaeologist uncovering a lost civilization, occasionally making soft sounds of recognition or muttering phrases like, "I knew it," and "finally." This is extraordinary, Dr. Warren said after an hour of careful review. Harrison documented a textbook case of what we now call predatory development, the systematic targeting of stable communities for asset extraction. But in 1979, we didn't have language for what he was witnessing. Dorothy Chin pulled out her notebook. Can you explain what that means in practical terms? Dr. Warren stood and walked to a whiteboard that still bore the remnants of some long-ago lecture. Imagine you're a development corporation looking for profitable opportunities in the late 1970s. Urban development is expensive and complicated. Lots of regulations, established property owners, environmental concerns. But rural communities offer something much more attractive: valuable land, minimal regulation, and economic structures that can be easily disrupted.
She began drawing a diagram showing connections between banks, regulatory agencies, and development companies. The strategy is elegant in its simplicity. First, you identify communities with development potential, good transportation access, natural resources, or strategic locations. Second, you create financial instability by pressuring local banks to close or sell. Third, you purchase distressed properties at below-market prices. Fourth, you implement development projects that maximize profit while ignoring community needs. Marina studied the diagram. And Morrison Development was doing this systematically across multiple states? Based on Harrison's evidence, yes. But what makes this case extraordinary is that Morrison appears to have corrupted the regulatory process itself. He wasn't just taking advantage of bank failures, he was manufacturing them. Frank pointed to one of the recorded conversations. What about these phone calls, where Morrison threatens Harrison directly? Dr. Warren's expression darkened. Those recordings document criminal conspiracy to commit fraud, extortion, and possibly racketeering. If this evidence had been available in 1979, Morrison would have faced federal prosecution. What about now? Marina asked. Morrison is still operating. His company is still targeting communities like Millbrook. Dr. Warren returned to her desk and pulled out a thick folder. That's why I'm going to help you. Over the past decade, I've been tracking Morrison Development's current activities as part of a broader study on corporate predation in rural America. Their tactics have evolved, but the fundamental strategy remains the same. She opened the folder to reveal maps, financial records, and newspaper clippings from dozens of small towns across the Midwest. Morrison Development has been involved in over 200 projects since 1980, almost all in communities that lost their local banks between 1975 and 1985. The pattern is unmistakable. Dorothy Chen was taking notes frantically. Do other communities know about this connection? Not yet, but they're about to. Dr. Warren smiled for the first time since they'd arrived. Harrison's evidence doesn't just document historical crimes. It provides the missing link that connects Morrison's past activities to his current operations. With this briefcase, we can file criminal charges, civil lawsuits, and regulatory complaints that could shut down Morrison Development permanently. Marina felt her heart racing. You really think we can stop him? I think Harrison Clark gave us the tools to finish what he started, but it's going to require courage, coordination, and probably some danger. Morrison has spent 45 years building political connections and accumulating resources. He won't surrender without a fight. Frank's phone buzzed with a text message. He read it and his face went pale. Marina, you need to see this. The message was from Margaret Sullivan. 3 black SUVs parked outside bank building. Men in suits looking around property. Thought you should know. Dr. Warren studied Frank's phone with the calm of someone who'd expected this development. Morrison is moving faster than I anticipated. He must be more worried about that briefcase than he let on during your phone conversation. Marina felt fear and determination warring in her chest. What do we do? We go public immediately, before Morrison can suppress the evidence or intimidate witnesses.
I have contacts at the Columbus Dispatch, the Cincinnati Enquirer, and the Cleveland Plain Dealer. We can have this story in tomorrow's papers if we act now." Dorothy Chen was already dialing her phone. "I'll call the contacts I mentioned yesterday. If we can coordinate stories across multiple newspapers simultaneously, Morrison won't be able to contain the damage," Dr. Warren finished. "Excellent thinking." The next few hours passed in a blur of phone calls, document scanning, and careful coordination. Dr. Warren proved to have an extensive network of contacts in journalism, law enforcement, and academia who'd been waiting for years for evidence like Harrison's briefcase contained. By evening, 3 major Ohio newspapers had committed to running front-page stories about Morrison Development's history of community predation. The FBI's White-Collar Crime Division had agreed to review Harrison's evidence for potential federal charges, and attorneys in 6 states were preparing class action lawsuits on behalf of communities that had been targeted by Morrison's development strategies. But the breakthrough came when Dr. Warren reached out to her former colleague at the Department of Justice. "Marina," she said, hanging up from a lengthy phone conversation, "I have news that would make Harrison very happy. The DOJ has been investigating Morrison Development for the past 18 months as part of a broader probe into corporate fraud in rural development. They've been missing the historical context that proves Morrison's activities constitute a decades-long criminal enterprise. Harrison's evidence provides exactly what they need." Frank looked stunned. "You're saying the federal government is going to prosecute Morrison?" "I'm saying that tomorrow morning federal agents will be executing search warrants at Morrison Development offices in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. Morrison's 45-year crime spree is finally coming to an end." Marina felt tears she didn't expect. Harrison would have loved to see this. "Harrison did see this," Dr. Warren replied gently. "He saw it clearly enough to preserve the evidence that would eventually bring justice. His vision just took longer to come to fruition than he hoped." As they prepared to leave Dr. Warren's office, Marina's phone rang. The caller ID showed Robert Morrison. Dr. Warren gestured for her to answer and put the call on speaker. "Miss Rodriguez." Morrison's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "I understand you've been busy today." "Just fulfilling a promise to an old friend," Marina replied. "You have no idea what you've done, the economic development that my company provides to rural communities." "You mean the economic exploitation," Dr. Warren interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of decades in legal academia. "Mr. Morrison, this is Dr. Elizabeth Warren. I'm sure you remember me from our correspondence in the 1980s regarding your regulatory violations."
There was a long silence. Then Morrison spoke again. His smooth confidence finally cracked. "This isn't over." "Actually, it is," Dr. Warren replied. "It's been over since the moment Harrison Clark sealed that briefcase in his vault. You just didn't know it yet." The line went dead. 3 months later, Marina stood in the restored lobby of what was now officially called the Harrison Clark Community Banking Museum and Resource Center. The building's Art Deco features had been carefully preserved, while modern technology had been seamlessly integrated to tell the story of community banking, corporate predation, and the importance of local economic control. The centerpiece of the museum was Harrison's vault, now open and displaying the briefcase that had brought down Morrison Development Corporation. Visitors could listen to the recorded conversations that had documented Morrison's crimes and study the financial records that proved how community destruction had been systematically engineered for corporate profit. But the museum was more than just a memorial to the past. Dr. Warren had helped Marina establish it as a resource center for communities facing similar threats, providing legal support, research assistance, and networking opportunities for local business owners and civic leaders fighting corporate predation. Frank Kowalski, now the museum's volunteer coordinator, approached Marina as she watched a group of visitors studying Harrison's evidence. "You know what I think Harrison would be most proud of?" he asked. "What's that?" "That his bank is serving the community again. Maybe not the way he originally intended, but serving it nonetheless." Marina looked around the space where Harrison Clark had made his last stand against forces he couldn't defeat alone. Now those same forces had been exposed, prosecuted, and stopped from destroying other communities. The vault that had protected his evidence for 45 years was now sharing that evidence with anyone brave enough to fight for their community's survival. Morrison himself was facing federal charges that would likely keep him in prison for the rest of his life. His development company had been dissolved, its assets seized and distributed to communities that had been damaged by his schemes. And across the Midwest, small towns were using Harrison's story as a model for protecting themselves against corporate predation. As the last visitors left that evening, Marina walked through the museum one final time before locking up. In the quiet of the old bank building, she could almost hear the echoes of all the conversations, dreams, and hopes that had once filled these rooms. Harrison's vision of community banking ended in 1979, but his deeper vision of communities controlling their own destinies was alive and growing. She turned off the lights and stepped outside into the Millbrook evening. Across the street, Frank was closing his barber shop, and down the block several locally owned businesses were preparing for another day of serving their community. The town wasn't the same as it had been in 1979, but it was something Harrison would recognize, a place where people looked out for each other and where progress meant strengthening the community rather than extracting wealth from it. Marina locked the museum door and walked toward her car, carrying with her the knowledge that sometimes the most important discoveries are the ones that have been waiting patiently for someone brave enough to uncover them. Harrison's briefcase had been hidden for 45 years, but its truth had proven more durable than the lies that had buried it. The abandoned bank had taught her something she'd never expected to learn, that the past and future are connected by the choices people make in the present, and that sometimes being brave enough to unlock one door can open possibilities that echo across generations. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.